Yeah, so hi everyone. So I am a volunteer for Alzheimer's Research UK, and I'm sharing my story about the psychiatric symptoms that my mum experienced when she had early onset Alzheimer's, and the effect that it had on me and my family. So. Just a little bit about me before I start. So yeah, my name's Emily Allen. I'm the youngest of three sisters and I live in Manchester, but my family and my parents actually live in Reading, just because that sort of added an extra layer of complexity to dealing with my mum with Alzheimer's. So she was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's back in 2010. And she was age 60 and I was in my early 20s, and she's now in a care home and has been for the last 2.5 years. So this is the most recent picture of me and my mum taken in the care home, probably about 5 months ago. Obviously, we're not allowed to see her since lockdown, but it kind of looks like she's smiling there. She probably actually isn't. I don't know if she's sort of able to do that, really. She can't talk or walk or sort of show much emotion these days, but it kind of looks nice, so I like the photo. And just to put a little bit more kind of, background behind this, just to show that we were a normal family once. So the top photo is us in Florida when I was 4, and we were a nice normal family. My mum was a lovely person. And the second photo is one that was after my nephew and niece, the newest additions to my family, were born, and that was mum. It's probably about 5 years ago. So this is my story. And it's just my experience, and I really don't have the technical terms for a lot of things. Very much just your average person going through this experience. It's the story of my mum's dementia from diagnosis to moving into a care home, which has happened very gradually over the past decade. But more importantly than that, the psychiatric symptoms that she experienced, because her behaviour and personality completely changed during that time. And it's had an absolutely huge impact on me and my family who have been caring for her. I'll also talk about the medications for mum's symptoms and their effectiveness, and what I'd like to see for new treatments for the psychiatric symptoms. Because some people, I don't know how much experience people have here of dementia. Some people experience, someone with Alzheimer's just fading away, and they just kind of become quieter and less like themselves. And whilst that's heartbreaking, it's not the experience we had. So we dealt with that. But on top of that, she was an incredibly unhappy Alzheimer's sufferer. So she wasn't just fading away. And I really can't tell you how profound an effect it's had on my life and the life of my family. So when mum was first diagnosed, well, firstly, this was 10 years ago, before Alzheimer's was big at all anyway, in the media and things, and it was misdiagnosed by the GP as stress for, I think, quite a few years. There was a huge stigma around the diagnosis, and I remember me and my sisters always being worried about mum for a good maybe probably 5 years up to the diagnosis, and we'd call it the big A because we just couldn't bring ourselves to actually mention the word Alzheimer's because it was just so scary, and what it actually meant. I remember looking up kind of chat rooms and stuff online and just being terrified at what the future would have in store. So we kind of went along with, yeah, hopefully it's just stress or depression or something that's making her like forgetful and things. But there were signs. One is that she was a massive reader, and she used to love books. So many books around my parents' house, and in the kind of few years, maybe a couple of years leading up to the diagnosis, she would start a book, and we didn't know this at the time. It's only after looking at books now that she'd been underlining like the main characters, and like trying to clearly desperately trying to follow a storyline, but she couldn't. So she would abandon a book after like a chapter, and I go back to those books now, and it really upsets me to just see like that she was really trying to follow this storyline, but she couldn't. She was brought up on Coronation Street from birth, as was I. So we used to watch that. That was a thing we used to always do together. And she also started saying, well, the storylines are too complicated, or, oh, so many new characters, and making excuses why she didn't enjoy it, but she just couldn't understand it anymore. She'd also buy loads of yogurts and loads of tins of things like pineapple and stuff, and she didn't know what was in the house, so she just there was an army of yogurts at one point in the fridge, which was I remember Dad getting annoyed. And also things like she went and bought some new glasses from Specsavers and spent a good £200 on them or something, and then they got lost immediately that day, never to be found again. We think they just went in the bin. So just things like that is very frustrating. So that's kind of what you're dealing with someone in the early stages of Alzheimer's. And Dad didn't even admit it to us at first. He said that Mum had been for some tests and she only had a bad memory, and it was only when my sister actually found the drugs that Mum was on, which was an Alzheimer's drug, and Googled them, that she then called me up and said, actually, I think Mum's actually got the big A. So we were embarrassed to tell people. It was a really, really big deal for us. Like I said, we didn't know anyone going through this at the time. There was nothing in the media, really. It was all very, very taboo and horrible. We didn't want to tell people because we felt like we were betraying Mum's dignity, but equally her friends also completely guessed that something was wrong because she'd turn up to occasions on the wrong day and things like that. Couldn't really kind of remember who had called when, and couldn't follow people's lives that well. So Dad retired early to care for Mum, and he even got cancer himself. He's fully recovered now, which is great, but that was also, he was a full-time carer for many, many years, and that's a huge pressure. And I was really young, so I think about 24 when Mum got diagnosed, but going through all this stuff beforehand. And most people are older who have a parent with Alzheimer's, so everything kind of, isn't set up for people my age really to be dealing with it. So first, it's just a lot of repetition. And, we got the same question from Mum hundreds of times, and you have to sound interested because it's so rude to, answer a question with, oh my God, not again. But it was a really slow decline. And I think the thing to get across with Alzheimer's is that I was losing my mum and beginning a new role as a carer, which meant that I had two major life changes going on, not one. And I was going down from Manchester to Reading, once or twice a month at least. And taking off time and stuff to support Dad. But not only that, I was caring for someone who no longer shows love in the same way, that person being my mum. And not only that, but because with Alzheimer's, you've lost someone, but my mum was still here in body, so no one really steps into the role like they might do if you lose someone. So I think you're kind of denied that opportunity to sort of grieve properly, but you are still grieving because you have lost someone. So it made me question what it is to be human, because what are we if not our collective memories and things, what religion, and it's had a profound influence on the life and decisions I've made. And one thing I noticed that me and my sisters did completely subconsciously, we only realized it a while ago, was that we call the old mum, the real mum, and the new mum, mumsy, because we just couldn't see the mum as what is, and I'll go into that in a minute, as the same person as who she was. And I think mumsy because maybe she was more childlike and vulnerable, and it's just too hard to see her as the same person. You have to compartmentalize. And so, and especially because we were doing things like finding things that would suit her, things like doing puzzles for 5-year-olds and stuff, which is hard to do with your mum. So going into the psychosis side of things, she had a lot of general symptoms. I'd say she was just angry most of the time. She would have her fist bunched. She'd be crying and sobbing a lot of the time. She always felt left out. That was a general kind of state of mind, I would say, most of the time. She really, really wanted to go to church. So she'd start saying, I want to go to church, and try and leave the house. And we never knew what she meant. And Dad diligently took her to church every Sunday. But even at church, she was agitated. It's not what she meant. She'd always thought that someone had stolen a painting as well, and this went on for years. She'd always suddenly get agitated and think that someone had stolen her painting, and she'd try and go into people's houses or shops or banks, or she'd stop people in the street and try and ask where the painting was, which is obviously quite awkward. And that would just be, if she's just in the house, she'd suddenly remember, oh my goodness, someone's stolen my painting, and would sort of go off and get really distressed. Quite a distressing thing for me. I got married in 2014, and she thought she wasn't invited to my wedding. And as you know, in the run up to a wedding, people talk about weddings quite a lot. Every time it came up in conversation, she'd say, why aren't I invited? And then she'd get really sad, and we'd say to her, but you are invited. And she'd say, no, you're not, I'm lying, you're lying, I'm never invited to anything, you don't love me, etc., and just get heartbreaking. So we had to stop talking about the wedding, full stop. This even to the point of, she sat next to my sister at the wedding, and Jane said, isn't it lovely, Emily's wedding? And she said, what wedding? I'm not invited, and burst into tears. So it was just this kind of constant psychosis of not being invited to things and always being left out that you just can't rationalize with. And it just meant that she was heartbroken all the time. And there's just this feeling that something was just so wrong, and it was really, really painful to watch in anyone you love. And it was constant. And she suffered from something called Sundowning as well, which I'm sure people here know, but it's when you get particularly agitated in the evenings. So this was kind of a general underlying feeling of her Alzheimer's, but it also got really bad at one point in October 2014, which is completely etched into my memory. And Dad gave us a call and said something's really wrong with Mum, basically. And so we dropped everything and came home, and Mum was just talking and talking and talking. It was absolute nonsense, this diatribe of just, I can't really explain it. If you've been around someone who's been in that state, you'll know, you kind of think you're going mad with them because they're just talking and talking. It doesn't really make sense. You're just trying to comfort. And this went on for, well, days, until she got medicated, really. She also wouldn't talk to Dad. She was really angry at him for some reason, and she'd shout and hit him, and that actually happened quite a lot during the years of him looking after her, that she'd often take it out on him, which, you know, as a middle-aged woman, that's okay. I dread to think what it's like if it's the other way around, and the person with Alzheimer's who's shouting and hitting is a man to a woman. So I remember, you know, in this particular, when things were really bad, you know, taking Mum out for a walk, for example, to get her out of the house, and we'd just be walking round and round a park, as she just had this constant nonsense coming out of her mouth, and it just didn't make any sense, and she was really agitated and distressed, and we had to call their mental health team, and the nurse said, to be honest, all you can do is keep her hydrated, because she's just talking so much, and that's not natural. And that's when we got her on medication, which I'll come on to in a minute. And we didn't want her to be sectioned, which would have been the natural course of events. But we didn't want that, because I think once someone with Alzheimer's gets sectioned, I'm not sure if you ever really come out, because will you ever be considered not crazy? I don't know. And she kept trying to escape, which is really dangerous, because she was angry with Dad. And like I said, she was trying to find this painting, which had turned to this big thing by this point. And she was just, angry, feeling left out. And there's this care home across the road from my parents' house, which had lights on and stuff, and she'd be thinking that there was a party in there and she wasn't invited, so she'd be constantly trying to get out the front door. So Dad would have to lock the front door, and then that led to, at one point, she called the police about Dad, and the police came around and obviously understood what was going on. But not a great experience, and a bit of a waste of police time. So what did this mean for us as a family? It meant that we never spent any time together as a family at all when we were caring for Mum, because we couldn't leave her alone. So someone would always have to be with her, and we couldn't talk around her because she felt left out and would get angry so easily. So we as a family, we couldn't talk. So bearing in mind, I've driven down from Manchester, you know, for these weekends and stuff, and I can't talk to my family. We are really just there as carers. If you know, family was there, we'd be eating our meals in silence. We wouldn't go out really at these points. It was too risky to take her to cafes and restaurants, really, although we did try. And it was, we'd split the days up into 2-hour slots. So for example, going back, you know, I remember like going back for Christmas, I go back for a good week, and it would just literally be the days split up into 2-hour slots, because you just get so exhausted by the end of the 2 hours, and you can't just make conversation. You can't ask a question because she doesn't really understand. You couldn't watch TV because she couldn't really focus on it. So how do you fill the time, you know, with someone like that? And that's when we kind of developed stuff like reading poetry to her, and doing these puzzles for 5-year-olds and kind of things like that, and just trying to, but it's really hard to have the energy all the time. And Dad couldn't even speak on the phone to us. So bearing in mind, I didn't live at home, because Mum would get angry if he was on the phone because she felt left out. So I didn't speak to my dad properly, I'd say, for about 2 years, which obviously had an impact on our relationship. So what it meant to me personally, obviously it's really hard to see my mum like that, and you know, this is where this mumsy came from, because it's too hard to see her as a real mum. You know, she was mumsy. You constantly try and comfort her, but it was hit and miss whether it worked. And you know, it's exhausting and heartbreaking, and I cried a lot, to be honest. And you know, I'd lost my mum, so I was grieving for a mum that wasn't there, as well as caring for this new kind of person in her place. And I worried about Dad, and he only told us half the stories. I mean, we only found out about the police thing like long after it happened, and Dad always said, "Oh no, it's fine." You know, we did worry about him because it was really hard. But ultimately, I didn't want to spend time with her, but I was doing it because we needed to as a family. But it wasn't enjoyable. It was really exhausting on many levels. So the medication that Mum took in that terrible time in October 2014, Mum was prescribed quetiapine, and the dose went up and up until she's on 225 milligrams, which I believe is quite high. She put on weight and couldn't fit in her clothes. I think that's one of the big side effects there. And we also had lorazepam, which we called the magic blue pill because it would calm Mum down instantly. And Dad carried one with him everywhere because if Mum suddenly started storming off, into the middle of the road, or getting really angry about her painting in the middle of a supermarket, he needed to calm her down. And there was always one in a little pot in the kitchen on the side, but we couldn't overuse it. We tried not to use it. Unless we absolutely had to, because it would make her sleepy, and then she might not sleep as well at night. And it was important that Mum slept at night, because if Mum didn't sleep at night, then Dad wouldn't be sleeping well at night. And you need Dad to have a good night's sleep to be caring for Mum, because that was his, job 24/7, absolutely no downtime at all. It also felt like we were sedating her, so there's something quite psychologically that didn't feel quite right about giving Mum a pill that would just knock her out. So although it did work, it felt a little bit wrong. But interestingly, once she went into the care home 2.5 years ago, she stopped taking quetiapine quickly and completely. And as far as we're aware, there's been no adverse side effects, which I found quite interesting. We've kind of wondered whether it did that much good anyway. She's also not had a magic blue pill since being in the care home either. So I think that's quite interesting. And for the sundowning, my dad read up and found out that there was like UV light bulbs that you can get, which he got for the downstairs, which did seem to work a little bit, because they kind of masked the physical going down of the sun, I guess. So this is Mum now. This was taken Mother's Day last year, because this year there would have been lockdown, we weren't allowed in. And I still worry about telling people about Mum. It's, it brings a conversation down. I don't want to. A lot of people don't really ask, to be honest. But it's really isolating and hard to cope with emotionally. And Alzheimer's, I'd say overall, is not a crowd pleaser. This is not a story that many people want to be hearing. And I still find it incredibly hard seeing Mum in the home. It's just a kind of battle of trying not to cry, to be honest. Since lockdown, we can't see her at all. And it's really sad for Dad, especially because he visited most days, and he can't now, and probably won't for a long time, if ever. And I think, the hardest thing about Alzheimer's for me in particular is that, when I go to the home, I feel like I need to tell, say to Mum, oh, I love you and stuff. And I don't really feel like that. I want to say, I miss you. But that's not really the done thing to say to someone that's still there in body. But this is a picture of her now anyway, and she's in a wheelchair, and she can't really she can't talk, she doesn't really engage in conversation, and that. So what happens next? This is probably the photo that upsets me the most. It's when Mumsy was Mum, and it's really hard to remember that, because you've got these two versions of the person that you're kind of trying to deal with. I think what's really struck me as I put this presentation together for this was that people will still be going through this in lockdown, which I just think's absolutely crazy. And I know that it's not just Alzheimer's that will be, it's mental health for many people, for many reasons, will be going through this kind of scenario, and to not have any outlet, and to have not have people support you and stuff. I don't understand how people are coping at the moment. And Mum was just in such a stress all the time. It had a massive impact on her mental health and her actual health, her safety, my family's relationships, and my quality of life, as well as all of our qualities of life. And I think the psychosis, the psychiatric symptoms were an absolutely huge part of this. And all the drugs that Mum took did have huge side effects, like the weight gain and the extreme drowsiness and things. So I guess, my conclusion here is that, it would be nice to have recognition for the mental and physical health of the people caring for their loved ones when they're going through a time like this, because it's just so hard. And I know that mental health is often the poor relation, but it really shouldn't be, because it's a massive issue for the sufferer as well as their family, and it really needs more research and treatment. And I think, you know, being a carer is hard enough, and I hope I've got across in my presentation today, that, you know, it's hard enough caring for someone and grieving, and you know, it would have been a lot easier if the psychiatric symptoms weren't there as well. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily. That was very moving. So do we have any questions from the audience? Okay, so I don't think we have any questions at the moment, but what I think is best is if we actually just, people post questions. Oh yes, okay, we have one question here.
Okay.
You are amazing and so strong. Thank you for sharing your story.
Oh, thank you.
How aggressive was the Alzheimer's at the beginning?
Aggressive. I think Mum's version of Alzheimer's was much more of a slow burn than others, because I know other people who've since been diagnosed and died in the meantime that Mum's even had it. So yeah, it wasn't particularly aggressive. It was, I'd say, in the early stages, it was just more annoying, because it was just the kind of general questions and things like that all the time. It's literally questions that I've answered from my mum hundreds of times, you know, hundreds. And then I think, you know, and then the kind of psychosis and stuff kind of started creeping in. And that's when it got really hard. But yeah, it wasn't particularly aggressive, I'd say. Yeah, more of a slow burn, which I think is kind of worse.